Hello, everyone. Hello. My name's Nicholas Pickard. I'm the chair of the Australian Society of Authors. Welcome to all of you. It's so wonderful to see such a great room of friendly faces. We've got members, we've got former board directors, we've got former chairs. Tom Keneally, thank you. We've got our colleagues across the literature sector, so it's really terrific to welcome you here tonight. I just want to invite, first off, Uncle Michael West from the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council to welcome us to country. Thanks, Uncle.
I was thinking of a colloquialism that you love books, don't you? Yes. Well, it's important. Books, when you think about it, are so important. We can share emotions, we can share ideas, we can share thoughts, we can challenge people. It's just like art, isn't it, too? Or same things. That's why I guess in here too, that it makes sense. Because the times when you think about it, we're living in very interesting times. It's been a couple of years we've been had difficult situation with the pandemic, and when you think about it too, that despots, dictators do not like intellectuals. No, they do not like the media that's not on their side, and they do not like the arts, because the arts and intellectuals and the media can challenge them. And I think we can see around the world that we have some at this stage. And we have been going through a difficult time the last few years, the pandemic. It is important that we do, in a moment, take a moment's silence to pay respects to our ancestors, because we will all become ancestors one day, and also pay respects to those we've lost the last few years. And we are going through this pandemic. We're not through the end. We're a fourth wave now. We need to remember that, and those who are vulnerable have underlying conditions. Obviously, Aboriginal communities and families have underlying conditions, people with compromised immunity, people with disabilities, and people who are a little older are also in that situation. We need to remember that these aren't just numbers. They were people with dreams, aspirations, had lives, part of families, part of community. And we need to remember these things and pay respects to them. We need to pay respects to country, because country is talking to us. I think louder and louder with these floods that we've seen around the country and the firestorms. We need to get back to caring for country and understanding her and respecting, because everything comes for her when you think about it, everything. And we need to pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners, elders and custodians, and we'll do that in a minute. Look, I'll get you to get out your phones, because I think it's very important to educate, and you guys do like education. And when we were growing up, we were told things like that Cook discovered Australia, but Aboriginal people were interacting with the world for many, many centuries, and I'll show you this. Now look at Huntingbird Manuscript Vatican, and you see a very familiar face in there. But also, think of this, the Brewarrina fish traps in New South Wales are more than 40,000 years old. Yes, I'm saying 40,000 years old. So we need to respect them, their aquaculture and engineering. And as Australians, you have a responsibility to look after our culture and our sites, because it's your culture and your sites too. For humanity, we need to protect them. So has anybody got that yet? The Huntingbird Manuscript Vatican. And what did you find? A cockatoo, yes. You see flying around here, sometimes upside down, sometimes chewing into things and biting things and acting quite crazy. And then what century is that? It's 13th. It's 1241, isn't it? So that's almost 800 years, about 20 years shy of 800 years. It's quite amazing. And we did trade. I made this the point the other day when I saw the Chinese ambassador. I said, we've done trade with Asia and Macassans for more than 400 or 500 years. I know the previous government said they had the first trade agreement, but hey, if you're trading for 400 or 500 years, obviously what they said was fake news. Because, it makes sense, 400 or 500 years trading, we would have negotiated around a fire, there would have been sharing stories, there would have been having a yarn, sharing tucker, just like sharing stories in books and that. And sharing culture. So that obviously has been going on for a long time. And I think we need to think about these things and get back to rebuilding relationships, I think, and acknowledging that. So it's quite amazing that about the sea cucumbers, the piranha, and also that hunting bird manuscript. So let's take that moment of silence and pay respect and to reflect our journey, and also, I guess, to centre ourselves, because we do have very busy lives, don't we? We have three beautiful waterways, the Hawkesbury, Nepean and Georges. These are the aquatic boundaries of our nation. To my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters out there, we warmly welcome you from country, from clan, from tribe, from nation. To all our brothers and sisters, think about it. We belong to one mob, one tribe, humanity. We warmly welcome you from the family, community, neighbourhood, family, and ultimately the country you come from. Think about this. We share a little blue sphere called Earth, floating through the ever-expanding cosmos. On behalf of Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, members, our elders and our board, welcome here. Continue telling the stories. As I said, it's pretty important, and particularly the times that we live. And I think when I look back in history, we don't want to be a country, and we don't want to see other countries burning books. And that heads down a dark passage when you think about it, when we look at our history. And we need to look at our history so we don't repeat it, but we learn from it and we become better citizens, because we need to be good global citizens, don't we? Yes, we need to be good global citizens. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. Festive season's coming up. You enjoy yourselves, but don't overdo it, I guess. And look, every family has its own idiosyncrasies, one might say. So have a good time and enjoy yourselves, and let's all work together and walk together for better outcomes than we can when we try. And something that we want to achieve might be hard, but it's worth achieving. Thanks.
Thanks, Uncle, for that welcome to country on this beautiful land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you. Tonight's annual event recognises Colin Simpson, journalist, author and television host, who worked tirelessly to improve the interests of writers. He was a founding member and early vice president of the Australian Society of Authors, where he led the campaign for lending rights in the early 1970s. As a result of this campaign by Simpson and the ASA, the public lending right was introduced in Australia in 1975 by the Whitlam government and remains an enduring legacy of Colin Simpson's efforts. Last year's keynote was delivered by Nyadol Nyuon on resilience and recovery. The year before, Tony Birch spoke about the power of writing. And in 2019, Ben Law addressed the Society on stories from the margin. Tonight we'll hear an address on the National Cultural Policy by the Honourable Tony Burke, Minister for the Arts. The ASA acknowledges and celebrates the fundamental contribution our writers and illustrators make to our national culture, and we'd like to start tonight by hearing from two extraordinary writers, both from the cultural powerhouse of Western Sydney. Omar Saka is an award-winning poet, essayist, novelist and editor. His acclaimed poetry collection, The Lost Arabs, won the 2020 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry and was shortlisted for many other awards. Omar's poems have been published in English, Arabic and Spanish, and he will read for us tonight the poem Diary of a Non-Essential Worker. It's an appropriate poem for this evening. Omar's reading will be followed by a piece from Sarah Ayub. Sarah is a freelance journalist, best-selling author and academic. She holds a PhD in migrant Australian young adult literature and regularly appears at festivals and schools. In addition to her novels, she is due to publish her second picture book later this year. She's also a member of the ASA board. After we've heard from Omar and Sarah, my fellow ASA board director and dear friend Bronwyn Brancroft will then introduce our guest speaker for tonight. And to conclude the evening, Deputy Chair of the ASA, Sophie Cunningham, will give a vote of thanks. Please join me in welcoming Omar Saka to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum. Diary of a Non-Essential Worker. Did you know violins can shake the earth? Such sweet vessels, tiny planetary throats. I was sent an orchestra. They made music a sorrow, a soaring that shivered the dirt. I followed the notes to a barbarism. The composer said he created the beautiful hour as a space to think about war. And I heard my mother's name, a dark cascade of her. I saw again the clamor behind her manner, her harrowed glamour. I am claiming all of it now, not as a violence, but as an inevitability, always justifiable. I guess I don't want to lose her, no matter the bruises. I haven't seen her in weeks, a memory of cherries, a perishable delight. I stay home, she stays home, and with this distance we become old battlefields, able to appreciate our damages without adding to them. How lucky we are to have homes. How likely it is we will lose them. Months ago, we couldn't breathe, and smoky miracles pulverized the sky, our fussy lungs. Everything is a miracle when you are alive. I am learning that against my will. Today, I was sent a pink dwarf kingfisher, a bird thought extinct for over a century, and still it was someone's job to look for her. Someone waited, camera in hand, for a glimpse of a glorious beak. Outside, I hear the camaraderie of ordinary wings, the chatter of birds we call pests. They don't seem to mind the lockdown. I dare say they're having fun, a lark. I call my landlord, ask for a reprieve, and hear only birdsong. He's having fun. I walk out into the park where months prior a man was stabbed near to death. I sit on the bench close to the stain his blood left, and receive a text reminding me to care about Kashmir and Gaza and our Uyghur brothers and sisters who I never stopped caring about and for whom my care did nothing. Forgive me. I sometimes mistake grief for care. The orchestra follows me under the foliage, the violins unrelenting, the world shaken to their curvature. Their high-strung demands as I sift through the scattered lyric of my shattered life to find a way to love a woman, and the birds weave and whirl in the green, laughing at this non-essential work.
Omar's always a hard act to follow. I wanted to write something new for tonight about how hard it is to be a writer in this day and age, but I couldn't fit it in 3 minutes. So I'm going to share an extract from my essay, Pride, Prejudice and Pining, from Arab Australian Other. I think we can all agree that adolescence is pretty tough. You're navigating bodily changes, questions about the future, changing friendships, and a burgeoning sexuality, unless you're a Lebanese girl, in which case the sexuality kicks in promptly on your wedding night and not a moment sooner. When you're a migrant, it's slightly worse. And when members of your community are newspaper fodder, you're basically done for. I fell into the latter category, and the prejudice phase of my Australian Lebanese existence began with the onset of the Arab-Australian moral panics on the cusp of the new millennium. The fact that I actually read the newspaper, dreaming that one day I would have my own journalistic career, insha'Allah, only amplified my growing awareness of my otherness. And I remember the years of Year 10 work experience and first jobs as the pivotal moments of deflection and justification. When people recognised that I was from Punchbowl via my accent and asked what my background was, there was always a but after Lebanese. I'm Lebanese, but I don't know any bikies. But my father's not in jail. But my brother's not a drug-dealing rapist who drives a $300,000 car while receiving Centrelink payments. I should have spent my teen years sticking posters on my wall and obsessing over boy bands. Instead, I worried a lot about how the outside world would see me and constantly felt like I had to justify my Australianness. I'd made it through 2 weeks of Year 10 work experience where I learnt that Ashley could also be a boy's name, and where white people could justify their racism by saying they had Arab friends. But how would I fare at university? Not very well, I can admit now with the gift of hindsight. But back then, I didn't understand why the Jewish guy kept his distance and why the girls were so fascinated by my nun-like life. They probably laughed behind my back, but I was so out of touch with the real world at that point that I didn't even notice. But still, I tried to fit in without changing too much of myself. In those years, I didn't hide the fact that I was Lebanese, even when it would have been easier than facing people's ignorance. When I'd eat hot chips at lunch, having recently discovered the joy of chips with vinegar and tomato sauce during Ramadan, and people would question why I was eating, I would tell them I was Christian. "Oh," they'd respond, "I thought you were Lebanese." The absence of my hijab probably baffled the crap out of them. And funnily enough, for some people, it still does.
Well, I can assure you that not many white people wanted to be our friends. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Marr and Sarah, for those readings. Very powerful and very illuminating. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft. I just happened to slip a PhD in before COVID, so thank you. I'm a Bundjalung artist and a writer and a director on the board of the ASA. In my career, I have published 45 children's books. I have 2 others in the pipeline with Hardy Grant Egmont. Got to put my publisher in there. Exhibited nationally and internationally and sat on multiple boards representing for decades and supporting and promoting other Aboriginal artists and Australian artists all my life in a voluntary manner. Books and art are my life. Art is my first language. As an Aboriginal kid growing up in a poor regional family, I owe much to Gough Whitlam and Labor's education initiatives for my initial degree, which I started at 17 in 1976. Being the last of 7 children, my dad was Aboriginal, my mum is Polish and Scottish, there was not a morsel left in the cupboard, especially not for further education. Without this, government support by a Labor government who love the arts, looking at you, Minister, a trade or an apprenticeship would have been my only option. I always think of all the people like me who would never have been able to rise to their full potential if this had not occurred. Government policy can create life-changing opportunities. There were only 2 people that could afford to go to further education in my family. My elder sister got a bursary, I think they were called, and I married my teacher. It's pretty funny. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce the Honourable Tony Burke, the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Arts, and Leader of the House of Representatives. Tony Burke has been the member for Watson since 2004. His portfolios reflect his lifelong commitments to working people and to the arts. Upon being appointed Minister for the Arts earlier this year, he promptly announced the consultation process for the National Cultural Policy. Artists and writers all over the country have appreciated the speed at which the Minister has moved to consult and create the policy. We have also been heartened by the Minister's valuing of the arts and the recognition of artists as workers. We are delighted he is joining us tonight. Please put your hands together in welcoming the Minister.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. Thank you to Uncle Michael for welcoming us to Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. It always astonishes me when we get a welcome to country, what a generous thing it is to do. When someone turns up, you don't have to say welcome. And there's a real level of generosity that I think often people overlook each time that welcome is given. So thank you, and I hope we can return that generosity, and I'm proud to stand here as a member of a government committed to delivering the Uluru Statement of the Heart in full. I also want to acknowledge, well, obviously thank Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft for the introduction, and both for Olivia Lanchester and my dear friend Nick Pickard, and also both Sarah Ayub and Omar Saker, both as magnificent poets, but also as very important voices for my part of Sydney. Now, it was mentioned in the intro that I am also Leader of the House. As Leader of the House, it means my job is to pretty much never deliver a fully prepared speech. That is entirely my world, and occasionally I have to do one. I had to do one in front of lawyers last Friday night because they loved section numbers and things like that. But I'm not very good at them, so I figure if there is an audience that will completely accept that there'll be a level of ad-libbing and not every word will be carefully chosen, it's yourselves. So if you can bear with me. National Cultural Policy, the consultation started. We're nearly at the decision-making process. I'm not at a point where I can make announcements tonight. But what I want to be able to do is to give a bit of an explanation of where some of the consultation and submissions have taken us, and the importance of the work that you do to the government. To be able to do national cultural policy quickly, we have cheated. And we have cheated by, instead of starting with, I often say the blank canvas, but let's say the blank page. Instead of starting with a blank page, we've started with the 5 headings of the previous cultural policy. Fix the order, made sure that First Nations is first, dealt with a place for every story. As the third pillar, the centrality of artist, both as worker and as creator, to deal with the importance of making sure that our institutions are strong, and finally to make sure that we're properly engaging with the audience. And those 5 pillars have formed the basis of the consultation. Everywhere I go, there is a passion about making sure that First Nations are first. It is both the right thing to do and the selfish thing to do. It is, when you start with what is different in Australia, what is our advantage as a nation compared to anywhere else on earth, it is the oldest continuous culture living here. And that needs to be the starting point, the foundation, the first principle of everything that follows. And that means when it comes to authors, whether it is the poetry that I often fall back on, which obviously by Udjurununukul, but the volume belonged to my parents and still bears the name as it was originally published, of Kath Walker, or whether it is the work more recently that I've read, be it Tara June Winch with The Yield, taking us through to that clash, those final scenes where you get the clash of what is so euphemistically referred to as the developers, with the protesters there wanting to preserve what always was and what needs to always be. Or whether it is the work of Claire Coleman, where when you purchase a book called Terra Nullius, you think you're reading one story, only to get halfway through and to be taken to an entirely different world. I think it's important to acknowledge as well is if First Nations are to be first, that doesn't simply affect the elevation of First Nations work. It also has an impact on the capacity of those of us who have a purely immigrant heritage, like myself, to change how we do our work as well. I'm conscious, and I acknowledge Thomas Keneally in the audience. I love the novel Two Old Men Dying, but one of the things that's fascinating before you even get to the novel is the foreword. And in the foreword, an acknowledgement that these days the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith would have to be written differently and should be written differently. And an acknowledgement in the way those stories are being told and the way the two men are millennia apart and their stories are told in that novel, is with a consciousness that we all need to learn, and one that, as Tom acknowledges, simply wasn't there in 1972. A year before that, in 1972, similarly, the travel diary written by Colin Simpson, The New Australia, dealt so much with First Nations sites and First Nations culture, but the presumption then in so many ways was that the voice would always be white, the lens would always be white. And in some of the issues I want to work through with you tonight, I want to deal with the importance of the narrative, with the story, but also of the lens, because they can be different, but they both matter. So tonight, I want to deal with things in two halves: authors and writers as workers, and authors and writers as creators. When we talk about authors as workers, we have the concept of how that work is developed. So I want to talk about the development, and then I want to talk about the money, because both matter. On the development, it's been a special day. I had an English teacher by the name of Michael Robson, and in year 12 he told me that he read a poem every day, and I thought that's a good thing to do. And to this day, there's a couple of days here and there that I've missed, but basically I read a poem out loud every day. The poem I read out loud today was Reaching Light by Robert Adamson, who many of you will know and will know is not well at the moment. I spoke to him on the phone while I was this afternoon, and the speech changed a bit as a result. In talking to Bob, he went through a similar story where, and it goes to the development of the writer, his English teacher wasn't called Mr. Robson, his English teacher was called Mr. Roberts. And Mr. Roberts changed his life. Bob had been undiagnosed, and pretty much anyone back then was undiagnosed if you were dyslexic. And Mr. Roberts worked out that that Bob could recite poetry, and so kept giving him poetry, and Bob would recite it, and he was good at it. And then he started to write it. And to be someone who then still went to leave school at 14, but ended up as the professor of poetry at the University of Technology, shows how significant those moments of development are. We talk about a whole lot of different forms of diversity, and they're all important. In terms of making sure First Nations is there is critically important. A Place for Every Story is about making sure that all the different forms of diversity within Australia are properly told. I do want to add one to the list that often misses out, which is class or wealth. And I add that to the list not because it's bigger than all the others, but just it often doesn't make the list. I worry and continue to worry about how many great artists we missed because they never had their Mr. Roberts. They never had that moment where the wonder of enjoying art was transferred to being told, you can create it too. You're worthy, it's possible, you can do this. It's why cultural policy is so important, to be able to have a whole of government process so that we can begin to change the course, so that we never again have the situation that we had with the previous Minister for Education standing up in the Parliament arguing that we had to stop funding arts education in the same way because we needed to train people for real jobs. I'm also mindful of the submission. I've read a lot of the submissions, not all, there's too many to read all. All of them have been read, just not all personally by me. But I think we were all particularly moved by one that was this long, from Helen Garner, where Helen Garner spoke about the possibility that was made available for development of work through the old Literature Board. The Literature Board, actually established by Alfred Deakin in 1908, which led Helen to be able to say she could be a writer who might have something useful and interesting to say to and for my fellow citizens. And in that development, it's not simply at school, it's the next layer as well. I'm tremendously proud, and the previous poets know this well, that the largest gathering of poets in Australia happens one suburb away from where I live at Punchbowl at Bankstown. And and there at Bankstown, young people gathering, some like me, perpetual audience. Well, I'm not one of the young people, but perpetually there is the audience, and many people there, some with magnificent poetry, some just working it out and growing, but all of them effectively through a community organisation, having their Mr. Roberts, having their person to say, your story matters, and here is your opportunity to tell it. The concept of the money for writers is something which has had a checkered history. Michael Massey Robinson was the first and only poet laureate we have had in Australia. He was awarded it in 1819 by the New South Wales government, and he won the grand prize of 2 cows. Michael has a fascinating story. He was actually transported as a convict for poetry. So Michael had written a rhyming quip about an alderman, yes, about a politician, linking them to a murder, where he then went to the person with, here's my poem, what are you going to do? Pay me some money or I put it out. And then was charged successfully with bankruptcy and was transported to the colony of New South Wales for the crime of poetry. But if you look at the prize that he received of 2 cows and match it with the average income for authors in Australia today of $18,200, we possibly haven't come that far. I did look it up. $18,200 will buy you 9 cows or half a bull. So there has been some level of inflation, but it's fair to say we're not keeping up. The Literature Board, established in 1908, I made the reference to Helen Garner. Similarly, it supported Thomas Keneally in his early career. And then we had the concept of the Book Council in 2014. One of the reasons that I wanted to get cultural policy established early in the term, even though it is the worst possible time to be asking for money within government, was because I wanted to change the trajectory and have cultural policy in place for long enough that it couldn't be removed. I never want to see again what happened with the Book Council, where the Book Council was established entirely in 2014, entirely funded by cuts to the Australia Council, and by 2015, just gone. My EFO gets dropped at the end of the year, and it's just gone. The work that you do is too important. I'm conscious that one of the sources of income is from the person we honour in the lecture tonight, Colin Simpson. Colin advocated for so long for public lending rights. Public lending rights have been incredibly important, but we have also missed an opportunity. If we look at during the pandemic, although we're still in the pandemic, if you look at during the lockdown period of the pandemic, we had an incredible opportunity for authors. Book sales went up. People wanted to use the time to read. In 2020, book sales went up 7.8%. The following year, another 2.5%. And public lending rights meant where someone borrowed a physical book from the library, that saw some possibility for improvement of income. But of course, by that stage, libraries had started to shift to ebooks. In 2020 alone, between March and May, there was a 300% increase in the borrowing by ebooks. So what increase did that mean in terms of income? Nothing. Because if a physical book is borrowed, public lending rights are there. If an ebook is borrowed to read the exact same story, word for word, in a different format, the policy has not yet caught up. The policy was something, even in the hardcover version, that we may well have missed out on. It was a moment of clarity from Colin Simpson, which some of these words have been explained to me in similar terms by many of yourselves. And I quote from Colin, "I got sick of getting nowhere with the libs by letter writing. I began to go after Whitlam personally. I used to turn up at functions, and it got so that him knowing what I wanted to talk about, he would hail me with, 'Colin, public lending rights, eh?' I am not suggesting this method of lobbying, please. But that advocacy was so important, and we stand on the shoulders of the work of Colin today. I don't know how soon we'll be able to transform what needs to happen with respect to ebooks. But certainly if I go through the submissions, the case has been made that we have to get there. But I then want to talk about the part that I love, authors as creators. I am so envious of creators. I am someone who loves the arts, loves poetry, loves reading. I am somebody who, as some of you know, loves music, but as the organiser of the official parliamentary pub rock band, I don't think I make the cut as an artist. But the work as creators that authors do matters in terms of the narrative, matters in terms of the lens, and then ultimately matters to the life of the reader. Now, we often start with the narrative, and so I will. The narrative for writers of non-fiction is easy to make its way through. I've nearly finished reading Claire Wright's You Daughters of Freedom to see where there are sections of Australia's history that have just been completely left out, and to get a sense of the way that Australian women didn't simply run the campaign for the vote here in Australia, but Australian women were the key figures in the United Kingdom as well. A critical part of our history. Yet, until Claire started writing, not given anywhere near the prominence that it needed to have. But the narrative will often find its way through forms of fiction as well. And I have to confess, I read a lot more fiction by choice than I do non-fiction. Enough non-fiction comes my way in my line of work. And I've always felt a risk in policymakers that you can surround yourselves with more and more non-fiction, and if you do that, where's the creativity going to come from? Where will the new ideas come from? I'm conscious of Paul Keating's love of Marr and his line to fellow ministers at the time when he'd played Resurrection Symphony No. 2, the Resurrection Symphony No. 2 by Marr to a group of the cabinet, and afterwards said to them, what does it mean? And they said, good music, yeah, good recording, yeah, nice vinyl player. He said, no, it means we have to do better. We have to do better. You can't listen to something that elevates you without knowing that we have to do better. And in your work, particularly with fiction, I always get that sense where you see not just the story, but how people feel during that story as the driving for us to do better. So when we have a story, and I referred earlier to Claire Coleman's Terra Nullius, where you start believing you are hearing a story of non-fiction, and then you're taken into a fictitious world where suddenly it's happening to you. does something with the reader that only writers can do. I've thought about that novel many times. I don't think it's possible to put it on stage or to put it in film. It can only live on the written page where the challenge is in our own imagination. But we have all learnt so much about how aspects of our own history need to be questioned, with Kate Granville's Secret River, or even how little some things have changed with the different references that are made more recently with Craig Silvey's Jasper Jones. And the stories can take us to more recent areas of our history. That great wave of post-war immigration and people working on dams, not just in the Snowy Mountains scheme, but the dams around Tasmania with Richard Flanagan's The Sound of One Hand Clapping, to get the sense of the emotion of the moment, which is only truly described in the written word. That immigration history continued in the most challenging way with Tanya Blanchard's The Girl from Munich, where you're faced with a part of history that you don't want to be sympathetic to anyone with, and yet telling the story of her own grandmother, where it's only at the very end of the story that the journey to Australia becomes real. But the whole story, because of our immigration heritage as being half of the story of Australia, that you know that you have read an Australian story when 95% of it took place offshore. And then there's a narrative where it's a gripping story and it's not necessarily part of history, but there's a validation in it. I could not stop turning the pages of Trent Dalton's Boy Swallows Universe. I was recently on the set of the film. I could not stop turning the pages of Jane Harper's The Dry. And as you read those novels, sometimes you think, yeah, this one will be a film. This one is going on to the next level. But you are taken into a world of great storytelling where it matters that those stories are told in a familiar way here. And then sometimes the narrative gets back almost to a First Nations principle from a non-First Nations author discovering the extent to which our story is told by the land. I find a direct link between and I'm one of the few people who read them in the reverse order, between Tim Winton's The Shepherd's Hut and Patrick White's Voss, where the land on which we now find our home tells the story and is the main character in the narrative. And so in all of those forms of creativity, the concept is obvious in terms of how they are an Australian story. But it goes beyond that with what authors do, and I want with cultural policy for us to acknowledge this and to cherish it and to help it along as well. I think the concept of perspective and the importance of the lens was probably made clearest to me with Christos Tsiolkas' The Slap, where every chapter is told of the same event from a different perspective. And in the same way, if you look at the first two novels from Hannah Kent, one, Burial Rites, set in Iceland, The Good People, set in Ireland. And I haven't read Devotion yet, which I know is set in South Australia. But for those two stories, clearly an Australian lens, even though the story is set overseas. The creativity doesn't only live in the narrative, it also lives in the creator themselves. It's in the same way that Stephen Carroll's work, where he's done his series on T.S. Eliot, is still a story that is distinctively being told by an Australian author, even though it's being set in London. And the poetry there, in that case, of a novel based on the poem Little Giddings, giving new life and expression to a work that has already existed. In the same way that we had the beautiful production from Leah Purcell with respect to the drover's wife, taking a poem that existed and adding every layer of dimension to take that story further. And so we have the narrative, we have the lens, but all of this then has to affect the nation and affect the reader. I think it's important to acknowledge, even though all the works that I've referred to so far would fall into the realm of what's normally regarded as adult literature, that this work all needs to begin from the moment a child is being read to, whether it's the work of Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft, whether it's a Mem Fox or a Jackie French. It matters that the stories children are being told from the start are stories that are familiar and that matter and that they then see around them. I think we often underestimate the impact of young adult fiction. Can I say, for my part of Sydney, the work of Sarah Ayub with "Hate is such a strong word," matters for people in my part of Sydney, young people, to see their suburb and their schools and their churches on the page in front of them. In the same way as when Rawa Arja wrote The F-Team, once again, set in Punchbowl, and for a local community to be able to see on the written word at that exact moment of high confusion that goes through in those teenage years, to know there is a validation from authors that the stories that are being held up are about you too, gives people a sense of place and allows people to learn about emotions of those who are close to them. When Michael Muhammad Ahmed wrote The Lebs, for those outside my community, they might think, oh, that was just the community talking to itself. But in telling the story through the narrator as another white young man, it was being told through the lens of somebody who was very much a minority within the local Islamic community in my part of Sydney. But then working through events such as some of the different emotions that were there when the community was being ostracised following the 11th of September 2001, allowed the events that everybody could reflect back on, in the same way that Sarah's work is reflected on the Cronulla riots, the same way as the F-Team set itself as a football game between my part of Sydney and the Sutherland Shire. That validation for the reader is something that only you can do. It is part of your gift to the nation. It is something I want to make sure we facilitate it. And so, while I've focused mainly on the works that I read as an adult, I want to make clear that a speech about a lot of what I've loved is not intended to be a speech about me. It's intended to be a speech about Australia. You are the storytellers for Australia. And you're the storytellers that don't just affect people's emotions, as all storytellers do. Great music hits you here. Great theatre, great film, great performance art, great visual art will capture you at the first glance and will affect your emotions deeply. But no one, and I mean no one, has a window into explaining the emotions of others the way writers do. And in that incredible gift, you provide the pathway for Australians to know themselves, for us to know each other, and for the world to know us. Your work, unlike performance work, doesn't live in the moment. And I love live performance because I love that concept of where you're there in the moment and you're living in the moment. But your work is creating a series of time capsules, beautifully gift-wrapped, just waiting to be chosen for someone to learn from, for someone to see maybe themselves and certainly each other. And where the comparison is different to live performance. Your work is still a community work. It is an individual experience that then affects how we share. You take the solitary experience that brings us together, the shared experience that we all start reading alone. We all hate it when someone reads over our shoulder. We want the experience to be completely between you and us. But once we have that experience, we want to share it because you have allowed us to better understand each other. So, cultural policy, if we get it right, and we're close, will provide you a better pathway to be able to do just that. It will provide you different forms of support to help nurture your work. And it will also provide something that has been missing for a decade, which is quite simply a government that says you matter, a government that says your work matters, a government that says to Australia, you are creators, you are workers, and you are required. Robert Adamson wrote beautifully in Winter Hospital Bed about the work that you do through poetry. I had no idea why poetry the squid caught me. It clung to my brain in the damaging climate, a creature in the alien element of air, arising from centuries of survival. Thoughts must be inky and capable of working the bait with a black beak for a quick kill and a metaphysical rise up through the abyss. Poetry in those days was a handmade lure. There were no fish or birds, so I spun my lines to the ones with heads spring-loaded with resentment, their temper a red fleck twitching in an eye, while poems of the future waited in line to hear my number. We want your poems of the future. We want your words of the future. We want the nation to be waiting in line for your next number, and we're determined to help you get there.
Thank you, Minister. It's really wonderful to have an Arts Minister who is a lover of literature, and as you say, it has been a while. I first met you, actually, well, the only time I met you when I was the last chair of the Literature Board of the Australia Council. And I've always felt a bit like Forrest Gump in terms I keep turning up in jobs as things are crumbling. And so I agreed very much that when you were saying that feeling and community are as important as story. And I think we're here tonight to talk about under circumstances like these, in straitened times, policy is actually as important as all those things if we're going to ensure that books of all kinds and writers of all types find their way into the world. And in these times, the importance of the ASA is clearer to us than it's always been important, but we're very clear of our remit at the moment, and the current ASA are really determined to rise to this occasion. And Minister, you joining us tonight, I think helps us in that endeavour, and we're really, really grateful to you. And we look forward to working with you and your government on a sustainable framework that supports writers and illustrators. And I agree with you that you agree with us that digital lending rights are important, and we really look forward to hearing more in the near future. You're welcome to stay for another hour or so for drinks and canapes, and thank you so much for coming, everyone. Yeah, no, I don't. So, yeah.